I want you to picture this. You're standing alone in a federal courtroom, no lawyer beside you, while the man you married for 15 years laughs and tells the judge you can't afford one. Behind him sits the woman he's been sleeping with, smiling like she's already won. And on the table in front of you is a document with your signature on it. A signature you never wrote. That was the moment I understood. My husband hadn't just betrayed me. He had built a case against me, one lie at a time, and he expected me to fall apart in front of everyone watching. He had no idea what I actually did for a living. My name is Elellanar Brooks. I'm a major in the United States Army, though you'd never have guessed it that morning. I wore a plain gray blazer over a white blouse. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would give away who I was before I chose to. 15 years of marriage had taught me that some battles aren't won by announcing your strength. They're won by letting people underestimate you until the exact moment it matters. The courtroom in Fort Worth was smaller than I expected. All pale wood and fluorescent light, the kind of room that makes everything feel both formal and painfully ordinary. I stood at the table on the left side, alone, my hands folded in front of me. Across the aisle sat Daniel, my husband of 15 years, in a navy suit that fit him a little too well for a man who claimed he was drowning in debt. Beside him sat his attorney, a sharp woman named Rachel Morgan, who kept glancing at me like I was a problem that had already been solved. And 2 rows back, dressed like she belonged at a gallery opening rather than a divorce hearing, sat Vanessa Reed, Daniel's colleague, Daniel's affair, the woman who thought she'd already won my husband, and judging by her expression, believed she was about to win everything else, too. Judge Thomas Whitaker looked up from the file in front of him, his reading glasses low on his nose, and scanned the room before his eyes landed on me. "Miss Brooks, where is your attorney?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Daniel got there first, his voice light, almost amused, like he was sharing an inside joke with the whole courtroom. "She can't afford one, Your Honor." I heard Vanessa's soft laugh behind me, quick and quiet, the kind meant to be heard by exactly the people it was meant to humiliate. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. 15 years of controlling my face under pressure briefings, deployments, casualty reports had prepared me for exactly this kind of theater, even if I never imagined I'd need those skills in a divorce courtroom. The judge asked me directly why I had chosen to represent myself. I kept my answer simple, because I meant every word of it. Because I wanted to hear everything they were going to say about me. That seemed to satisfy him enough to proceed. And proceed he did. Daniel's attorney began reading from a prepared statement, and I listened as my husband's version of our marriage unfolded in that courtroom, like a story he'd rehearsed 100 times in front of a mirror. According to him, I had neglected our family in favor of my career. I traveled too often. I controlled our finances with an iron grip. I had, in his words, used my military position to intimidate him during arguments, and now he claimed I was doing it again, refusing to negotiate, refusing to compromise, weaponizing my rank against a man who only wanted a fair settlement. He wanted the house. He wanted control of a significant portion of our assets. And then he said the thing that was clearly meant to land, the hardest, the thing I could tell he'd been saving. He told the court that our marriage had ended long ago in every way that mattered, because I was no longer the woman he married. I looked at him. I really looked at him the way you look at someone when you finally let yourself see clearly instead of hopefully. And in that look, something settled in me. Daniel wasn't just trying to end our marriage. He was trying to write the story of it, casting himself as the wounded party, and me as the villain who drove him away one convenient detail at a time. When his attorney finished, she stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the table between us. Inside were printed emails, financial statements, wire transfer records, and several documents referencing my work details that had no business being pulled into a civil courtroom. Details I hadn't authorized anyone to share. I opened the folder, slowly scanning the first page, and that's when I saw it. A signature at the bottom of a financial disclosure form. My signature, or something close enough to fool a stranger. Except I had never seen this document in my life. I stared at it a moment longer than I should have, feeling the room narrow around that one small detail, that one small lie sitting in plain sight among 100 others. "That wasn't my signature," I said. Daniel didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair with the same easy smile he'd worn since the moment I walked in, like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome and found none of them threatening. "You'd be surprised," he said, "what your own records can prove." I looked down at the folder again, at the forged signature, at the careful stack of paper my husband had built to bury me. And for the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom, I wasn't angry. I was curious because Daniel had just made a mistake he didn't know he'd made yet. He had shown me exactly how far he was willing to go. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact season everything changed, though at the time, I didn't want to see it for what it was. It started about 8 months before that courtroom in the quiet, unremarkable way most betrayals do, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a slow accumulation of small ones, each easy enough to explain away on its own. Daniel changed the password to our joint banking app and said it was for security. He started receiving mail, addressed only to him. Business correspondence he claimed nothing worth mentioning. His business trips multiplied, and so did the calls from a number I didn't recognize. Calls he always took in another room with the door mostly closed. And then there were the questions, small, oddly specific questions about my deployment schedule, my travel dates, when exactly I'd be reachable, and when I wouldn't be. At first, I told myself this was just what happened to marriages under strain. 15 years is a long time. People drift. People get tired. People stop reaching for each other in the ways they used to. I didn't want to believe my husband was capable of anything worse than exhaustion. I had built my entire career on reading situations clearly, on separating fact from assumption. And yet, in my own home, I chose comfort over clarity for months longer than I should have. The hotel receipt was what cracked that comfort open. I found it folded into the pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner. A printed confirmation for a room in Charlotte, dated the same weekend. Daniel told me he'd be in Charlotte for a supplier meeting. That part matched. What didn't match was the second name on the reservation. Vanessa Reed, his colleague, a woman I'd met exactly twice at company events, and remembered mostly for how carefully she avoided looking at me. I didn't confront him that night. I've never been someone who reacts in the heat of a discovery. Years of briefings and after-action reports taught me that the first read of a situation is rarely the complete one, so I watched instead. I paid attention to patterns I'd been too generous to notice before, and within a few weeks, I found something that mattered far more than a hotel room. A transfer, a significant one, moved out of our joint savings account into a limited liability company, with a name so bland it seemed engineered to avoid suspicion. Ridgeline Consulting Partners. When I looked deeper, the registered agent connected back to an address I recognized, Vanessa's building. When I finally asked Daniel about it directly, he didn't deny knowing about the transfer. He got angry instead, which told me everything the denial wouldn't have. He stood in our kitchen, arms crossed, voice rising in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "You trust your uniform more than you trust your husband," he said. That sentence landed exactly where he meant it to. For a moment, I actually wondered if he was right. If the discipline that made me good at my job had made me a worse wife, more suspicious than loving, more analytical than warm. Self-doubt is a strange thing. It doesn't need evidence to take root. It only needs a small opening. And Daniel had spent years without my realizing it, learning exactly where mine was. But doubt doesn't erase facts. And a few weeks later, I found something that made the doubt collapse entirely. Buried in a drawer in his home office beneath old warranty paperwork he never bothered to file properly, I found a folder, divorce paperwork already drafted, statements already prepared, painting me as controlling, unstable, emotionally volatile, a woman whose military career had made her incapable of functioning as a wife. He had been building this file for months, quietly, methodically, the same way he approached everything in his professional life. Worse than the paperwork were the recordings. I found them almost by accident. Audio files saved under generic folder names on a shared cloud drive we'd set up years ago for household documents. Recordings of arguments between us, but not full arguments, fragments. The parts where my voice rose, where frustration bled into my tone, where I said things I wasn't proud of. Every recording started a few seconds after his own provocations and ended a few seconds before any context that might have explained mine. Sitting there at his desk, listening to my own voice edited into a stranger's anger, I finally understood something I'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't a marriage quietly falling apart under the weight of two busy careers. This was a campaign. Daniel hadn't just stopped loving me somewhere along the way. He had started building a case against me, collecting ammunition long before I even knew there was a war. I sat in that office for a long time after I closed the folder, the house silent around me, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not heartbreak exactly, though that was there too, buried under something colder and more useful. 15 years of military discipline had taught me that the moment you understand you're in a fight, self-pity becomes a luxury you can't afford. You stop asking why, at least for now, and you start paying attention to how. Daniel thought he was several steps ahead of me. He thought the recordings, the transferred money, the prepared statements gave him control of the narrative, before I even knew there was one being written. What he didn't understand, what he wouldn't understand for months yet, was that a woman trained to notice small inconsistencies in complicated systems does not stay confused for long. He had built his case in the dark, assuming I'd never think to look. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. Once Daniel filed the paperwork, everything moved faster than I expected, and I understood quickly that speed was part of his strategy. He wanted to petition for control of the house before I had time to organize a proper response, and he timed it deliberately to coincide with a military assignment that would keep me occupied and partially unreachable for weeks. I was managing logistics coordination for an extended operation during that stretch. The kind of work that doesn't pause for personal emergencies, the kind that requires my full attention, precisely because other people's safety depends on my focus. Daniel knew this. He had spent 15 years learning my schedule, my deployments, the rhythms of my career, and now he used that knowledge against me, with a precision that would have almost impressed me if it hadn't been aimed at dismantling my life. While I was buried in operational demands, he was busy building a narrative among people who had known us both for years. He told our families, our old friends, anyone who would listen that I had chosen the army over him, over us, over any real chance at a normal marriage. It's a simple story, and simple stories travel fast. His parents, who had always been warm toward me, grew distant within weeks. Mutual friends stopped reaching out. Vanessa began appearing in public with him more openly now. At company dinners at a charity gala, I heard about secondhand, always positioned just close enough to suggest she wasn't going anywhere. And then Daniel added a new thread to his story, one that made my chest tighten every time I heard it repeated back to me. He started telling people I was the one seeking revenge, that I couldn't accept he wanted out, that my sudden interest in our finances was really about punishing him for daring to leave. It was a clever inversion. The man building a case against me in the dark was now telling everyone I was the aggressor. The financial blow came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of day that gives you no warning before it changes everything. I logged into our joint account during a short break between meetings and found the balance nearly emptied. Over $180,000 gone transferred in a single move to a business account I didn't recognize. When I called Daniel, his voice was calm in a way that told me he'd rehearsed this conversation. "That's business money," he said, like the explanation was self-evident, like 15 years of savings simply belonged to whatever entity he decided to funnel it into. I knew better. I knew every dollar in that account knew which deployments had funded, which portions of it knew the sacrifices behind every number. But knowing wasn't enough. A temporary court order had frozen a portion of our remaining shared assets pending the divorce proceedings, which meant that even the money that hadn't been drained yet was suddenly out of reach. I couldn't access enough capital to retain the kind of attorney this fight clearly required. Not quickly, not without months of legal maneuvering I didn't have time for. This is the part people rarely understand about that courtroom moment, the one where Daniel laughed, and told the judge I couldn't afford a lawyer. It wasn't poverty, it was engineering. My husband hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had constructed a financial trap, specifically designed to leave me standing alone at that table. And then he'd made sure the whole room believed it was my own failure. So I did what I've always done when a situation exceeds the resources I have on hand. I stopped trying to solve everything at once and started reading carefully, methodically, everything Daniel's attorney had already filed. I spent my evenings after operational duty going through every document, cross-referencing dates, noticing small inconsistencies that wouldn't mean anything to most people, but meant everything to someone trained to spot discrepancies in complex reports. One inconsistency stopped me cold. Buried in a financial disclosure meant to justify some of Daniel's requested settlement terms was a reference to a defense contracting bid, one connected to his company, one that cited operational details bearing an uncomfortable resemblance to information from my own professional world. It wasn't classified material laid out explicitly. It was more careful than that, more deniable, but it was close enough, specific enough, that it made the hair on my arms rise. I read it 3 times before I let myself consider what it actually meant. Daniel wasn't just trying to win a divorce settlement. Somewhere in the process of building his case against me, he might have crossed into territory that had nothing to do with our marriage, and everything to do with his career, his company's advantage, and information that should never have made its way into these documents in the first place. I sat with that realization for a long night, turning it over, refusing to let emotion rush me into a mistake. Then I picked up my phone and called someone I trusted. Completely a colleague I'd worked alongside for years, someone with the right background, to tell me whether I was seeing something real or letting grief and anger distort my judgment. "Can you verify one document for me?" I asked, keeping my voice level professional the way I'd trained myself to sound, even when nothing about the moment felt professional at all. There was a pause on the other end longer than I expected. Long enough that I felt my pulse pick up before he said anything at all. "Eleanor," he finally said, his voice careful in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Where did you get this? I want to be clear about something, because it mattered to me then, and it matters even more now looking back. I never used my position to dig up information about Daniel out of spite. I never accessed anything I wasn't authorized to access. Never called in a favor to punish a man for cheating on me. Whatever else this story is, it isn't about a woman abusing her rank to destroy her husband. It's about a woman who followed the process exactly as she was trained to, and let that process do what it was designed to do." When my colleague asked where I'd gotten the document, I told him the truth. I explained that it had surfaced in my own divorce proceedings, filed by my husband's attorney as part of a financial disclosure, and that something about the operational language inside it had struck me as wrong. I didn't ask him to look into Daniel personally. I didn't ask for a favor. I asked him what the correct channel was for reporting a potential mishandling of protected information, and then I used exactly that channel, filing a formal report through proper security oversight rather than trying to resolve it myself. That distinction mattered more than anything else I did in the following weeks. An internal review opened, slow and procedural, in the way these things always are, methodical rather than dramatic. I wasn't part of the investigation. I couldn't be given my personal connection to the subject, and I respected that boundary completely. All I could do was wait, continue functioning in my actual job, and let people whose entire profession was verifying exactly this kind of thing do their work. What came back, weeks later, through channels far removed from anything emotional, confirmed what I'd suspected, sitting in Daniel's office months earlier. He had accessed certain materials outside the normal scope of his role, materials tied to a defense contract his company was pursuing. Not all of it rose to the level of formal classification, which made the situation murkier, and in some ways more damning, because it meant Daniel had operated in exactly the gray area a person exploits when they know precisely how far they can push without triggering an obvious violation. Some of what he'd used, though, had originated from protected systems he had no legitimate reason to touch. He hadn't accessed it directly. Someone had passed it to him. I didn't need much imagination to guess who. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself with a clarity that made my stomach turn, even as some detached professional part of me recognized the shape of it. Daniel and Vanessa weren't simply having an affair born out of boredom or midlife dissatisfaction. They were using pieces of information connected to my career, filtered through an intermediary, with just enough distance to obscure the source, to give their company's contract bid an edge it shouldn't have had. And somewhere in constructing the paper trail, meant to justify that advantage, Daniel had used my name on documents I'd never seen, attaching my signature to financial disclosures I hadn't written, weaving me into a scheme without my knowledge or consent. That explained the forged signature sitting in the courtroom folder. It wasn't just a lazy shortcut in a messy divorce filing. It was a thread connecting two entirely different betrayals stitched together by a man who had apparently stopped seeing any meaningful line between his marriage and his business dealings. I made a decision that night that I've never regretted. I wouldn't confront him with any of this outside of the proper venue. I wouldn't call him, wouldn't accuse him over dinner, wouldn't give him the chance to construct another story before the facts were fully documented. I gathered everything, organized it the way I'd organize any operational report, and I waited for the next scheduled hearing, the one Daniel believed would finalize his advantage. He had no idea any of this was happening. As far as he knew, his plan was proceeding exactly as designed. His attorney was preparing a lengthy presentation meant to paint me as unstable and vindictive. Vanessa had grown bolder, appearing at more events on his arm, apparently confident that whatever consequences existed for their arrangement would never reach her. Daniel himself seemed almost relaxed. In the days leading up to the hearing, the ease of a man who believes he's already won. I spent those same days differently. I requested leave for the hearing date and used the time instead to review every document one final time, checking dates, checking names, making certain nothing in my account contained a single inaccuracy Daniel's attorney could exploit. And on the morning of the hearing, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I put on my dress uniform, pressed and precise every ribbon and insignia exactly where regulation required, and covered it with a plain civilian coat. I wasn't planning to make a show of rank. That was never the point, and it never became the point later, no matter how the moment eventually looked to everyone watching. I simply wanted to be prepared for whatever the day required, in every sense of that word. I looked at myself in the mirror before I left, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a woman scrambling to catch up to her husband's plan. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a report she already knew the ending to. Daniel thought he understood exactly what he was walking into that morning. He had no idea. The hearing room felt smaller than I remembered from the first proceeding, though I suspect that had less to do with the architecture and more to do with what I already knew walking in. Daniel sat beside Rachel Morgan, with the same practiced confidence he'd worn for months, the posture of a man who believes the outcome has already been decided in his favor. Vanessa took her seat 2 rows back, dressed the way she always dressed for these appearances, like someone attending a performance rather than a dismantling. Rachel began exactly where I expected her to begin, painting a portrait of me that had grown more elaborate with each filing. According to her closing narrative, I was a woman consumed by control, someone who had used the authority of my military position to intimidate my husband throughout our marriage, someone too emotionally unstable to be trusted with shared assets or implicitly with anything requiring calm judgment. She used words like obsessive and erratic, words designed to plant a specific image in the judge's mind before I ever had the chance to speak for myself. Daniel turned toward me at one point during her presentation, leaning slightly forward with that same casual cruelty I remembered from the first hearing. "You don't have the money for a real lawyer," he said, just loud enough for the room to catch it. Vanessa smiled behind him. I felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in my chest, and I let it rise. Let it move through me the way I'd trained myself to process anything sharp and immediate without letting it control my next action. Judge Whitaker looked up from his notes. No, attorney, he asked the same question from the first hearing, delivered with the same measured neutrality. She can't afford one, Daniel said again, quicker this time, almost eager. The judge turned to me and asked if I wished to respond. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for anger, though I had plenty available to me. Instead, I reached for the coat draped over my shoulders and removed it, folding it once and setting it over the back of my chair. Underneath my dress uniform sat exactly as I'd arranged it that morning, every insignia in place, every detail precise. I heard the shift in the room before I saw it. A small collective intake of breath chairs creaking as people adjusted to look more closely. Daniel's face changed. First, the confidence draining from it in real time. Though I hadn't said a word about rank yet, I wasn't there to impress anyone with a uniform. I was there to correct the record. Your Honor, I said, keeping my tone level. Before we discuss whether I can afford an attorney, I'd like to clarify one thing in Mr. Brooks's filing. I stepped forward and placed a document on the table in front of the judge. A document connected to a security clearance review. Daniel's company had submitted months earlier as part of a separate unrelated proceeding, one the judge himself had presided over before this case ever reached his docket. I had learned this connection only recently, through the same proper channels that had confirmed everything else, and I had waited for exactly this moment to raise it. I looked directly at the judge who approved your security clearance. The question landed strangely in the room, not aimed at Daniel, not an accusation shouted across the aisle, but a quiet procedural question directed at the one person whose signature connected two documents that should never have contradicted each other. The room went still in a way that felt different from ordinary courtroom silence. Judge Whitaker's expression shifted from mild attentiveness to something sharper, more focused. Daniel looked between us, confusion breaking through his composure for the first time. He clearly hadn't anticipated this angle, hadn't imagined the conversation moving anywhere near his professional paperwork. I explained calmly, without embellishment, that the judge had previously reviewed and approved a procedural matter connected to Daniel's clearance status during an earlier unrelated case, and that the version of events reflected in the financial disclosures Daniel had submitted to this court directly contradicted the official record from that earlier proceeding. I wasn't accusing the judge of wrongdoing. I was pointing out as plainly as I could that someone had introduced a document into this case containing information that didn't match what the court itself had already verified elsewhere. I never raised my voice. I never mentioned my rank as leverage. I simply laid the inconsistency in front of the one person in the room whose job was to notice inconsistencies for a living. Judge Whitaker studied the document for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he looked up first at Rachel Morgan, then at Daniel. Where did this document originate? He asked, his voice carrying a new edge. The practiced neutrality of the courtroom, replaced by something closer to genuine scrutiny. Rachel glanced at Daniel, and for the first time since I'd known her, I watched her composure waver just slightly, just enough for me to see it. Daniel didn't answer right away. He sat very still, the way people do when they suddenly understand that the ground beneath them has shifted, and they no longer know which direction is stable. I hadn't threatened anyone. I hadn't raised my rank like a weapon, or demanded the room to my authority. I had simply asked a question, precise and quiet, the kind of question that only makes sense if you already know exactly where the answer will lead. And watching Daniel's face in that moment, I understood that he finally knew it too. Judge Whitaker didn't move quickly. That surprised me at first, given the tension that had settled over the room after my question. But I understood, watching him work through the documents in front of him, that men who have spent decades in courtrooms don't react to tension the way the rest of us do. They slow down. They verify. They let silence do work that words can't. I'll ask again, he said, looking directly at Rachel Morgan. Where did this document originate? Rachel turned to Daniel, and for the first time in 2 hearings, I watched her lose the composure that had defined every appearance she'd made on his behalf. She asked him quietly but audibly where he'd obtained the disclosure. Daniel hesitated, then did exactly what I expected a man like him to do when cornered without a prepared script. He blamed Vanessa. He said she had provided the underlying data, that she'd assured him it was appropriate for use, that he'd trusted her professional judgment on matters connected to their shared work. Vanessa, sitting 2 rows back, straightened immediately, her earlier composure cracking into something sharper. "That's not true," she said loud enough that the judge had to ask for order. "I never told you to submit that. I never told you to use her name on anything." The two of them began speaking over each other, each trying to shift the weight of the moment onto the other, and I sat back and let them. I had no interest in participating in that particular unraveling. I had spent months building a record based on verified fact, not accusation, and I wasn't about to abandon that discipline now, not when it mattered most. So, I stayed quiet, hands folded, while Daniel and Vanessa dismantled the careful narrative they'd spent months constructing together. Judge Whitaker called for a recess to review the documentation properly, and when the hearing resumed, the tone in the room had changed entirely. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way courtroom dramas usually are. There was no shouting, no dramatic reveal delivered with a flourish. It was slower than that, more procedural, each piece of evidence introduced and verified. In turn, the way real consequences tend to arrive methodically, irreversibly. The signature on the financial disclosure was confirmed as forged, matched against verified samples of my actual signature from military and banking records. Several emails submitted as evidence of my supposed instability were found to contain edits inconsistent with the original message, headers, timestamps that didn't align with server records, phrases altered just enough to change their meaning. The transfer of funds into the LLC connected to Vanessa was traced clearly, the paper trail leading exactly where I'd expected it to, and the origin of certain operational details referenced in Daniel's business filings was confirmed as connected to information he had no legitimate authorization to use, obtained indirectly through channels that were now themselves under separate review. Judge Whitaker suspended several of Daniel's requested claims on the spot, citing the fabricated evidence as sufficient grounds to disregard the underlying narrative his attorney had built the case around. He noted formally for the record that a separate investigation into the misuse of protected information would proceed independently of the divorce proceedings, and that outcome, whatever it turned out to be, was now entirely out of my hands and out of Daniel's control as well. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to how I think about that day. Even now, I felt no triumph watching it unfold. I didn't feel the satisfaction people might expect from a moment like that. I felt something quieter, closer to relief, the specific relief of watching a system function exactly the way it's supposed to function, when you finally stop trying to carry the entire weight of a fight by yourself. I hadn't destroyed Daniel in that courtroom. I want to be precise about that distinction, because it's the one that matters most to me. I hadn't used my position to manufacture consequences for him. I had simply stopped shielding him from the consequences his own choices had already set in motion. Vanessa's company opened its own internal review once word of the contract irregularities reached them, a review that would eventually end her position there entirely. Though I wouldn't learn the details of that until much later secondhand from people who still occasionally mentioned her name like it belonged to someone from another lifetime. Daniel, for his part, seemed to physically shrink as the hearing progressed, the confident posture from earlier collapsing into something smaller, more uncertain. At one point, during a brief pause while the court clerk organized documentation, he turned toward me, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. "You could stop this," he said. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, and in that look, I let myself finally feel everything I'd been holding back for months. The betrayal, the exhaustion, the strange grief of watching someone you loved reveal exactly how little he'd ever actually seen you. "No, Daniel," I said. "I didn't start this." He stared at me, something desperate flickering behind his eyes. Then who did you did? I said. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences. He didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Brooks was completely out of words, and the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly the story he'd built around himself had finally collapsed. I won't pretend the aftermath felt cinematic, because it didn't. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no moment where Daniel fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness while the courtroom watched. Real consequences rarely arrive that way. They arrive slowly in paperwork and phone calls and quiet legal proceedings that stretch across months, each one chipping away at the version of a life someone thought they'd secured for themselves. The divorce settlement, when it finally concluded, reflected everything the court had verified. I retained the portion of our assets that was legitimately mine, and the funds Daniel had quietly funneled into that LLC were factored directly into the division of property, treated not as separate business capital, but as exactly what they were, money taken. Without my knowledge from an account we had built together over 15 years, Daniel bore the financial and legal weight of what he'd done. Not because I demanded it, but because the record left no other honest conclusion available. Vanessa's departure from her company came a few weeks later. Quiet and unceremonious, the kind of exit companies engineer specifically to avoid drawing attention. I heard about it through a colleague who mentioned it in passing, the way you might mention a change in weather, and I found I felt very little when I heard it. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a kind of distant acknowledgement that consequences had found their way to everyone who'd earned them. Daniel didn't end up with the life he'd apparently pictured for himself when he started building his case against me 8 months earlier. I don't know the full shape of what he lost professionally or personally because I stopped tracking it fairly early on. There's a particular kind of freedom in choosing not to know, in letting someone else's unraveling happen somewhere outside your field of vision. As for me, I went back to work. There's something steadying about returning to a job with clear procedures and defined responsibilities after months of navigating something as chaotic as what Daniel had put me through. I continued my career for a while longer and eventually transitioned into a role with fewer travel demands. A decision I made for myself on my own timeline without anyone else's narrative shaping the choice. I bought a house not long after the settlement finalized. Nothing extravagant, nothing meant to prove a point to anyone who might be watching. Just a small place with good light in the kitchen, and a yard big enough for the garden I'd always wanted and never had time for. During the years I was busy protecting a marriage that I eventually understood had stopped being mutual, long before I was willing to admit it. Daniel wrote to me once several months after everything was finalized. I still remember standing at my kitchen counter, turning the envelope over before I opened it, half expecting another attempt at manipulation. Another carefully worded appeal, designed to make me feel responsible for his consequences. Instead, the letter was short, almost stripped bare of the performance I'd grown used to from him. I never thought you would actually fight back, he wrote. I read it twice, and then I folded it and placed it in a drawer, not because I needed to keep it, but because I wasn't ready yet to decide what it meant to me. I never wrote back. Some silences say more than any response could. Months later, I stood in front of my mirror one morning, adjusting the collar of my uniform before heading into work, and I found myself thinking back to that first hearing, to the moment Daniel laughed and told the judge I couldn't afford an attorney, to Vanessa's quiet smile behind him, to the particular loneliness of standing at that table, with no one beside me. Daniel had believed in that moment that standing alone meant I was powerless. That's what he'd built his entire strategy around, the assumption that a woman without a lawyer in the room was a woman without options. He never understood that sometimes standing alone is exactly how you discover how strong you actually are. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to see me as some kind of hero, and I don't tell it because I think Daniel deserves to be remembered as a villain in some simple cartoonish sense. People are more complicated than that, even the ones who hurt us badly. I tell it because I think a lot of people, especially people who've spent years being underestimated in their own homes, need to hear that quiet, steady persistence is its own kind of power. You don't need to raise your voice to be taken seriously. You don't need to destroy someone to hold them accountable. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stop protecting the people who never protected you. I didn't destroy my husband. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I simply stopped saving him from the consequences of his own choices. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it found you. Are you watching this on a quiet evening, winding down after a long day, or maybe during a morning coffee before the world gets loud? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and it means more than you know to hear how these stories reach you. If Eleanor's journey resonated with you, I've got so many more stories like this one waiting to be shared. So, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Thank you for standing with me through this story. I was about to sit at the dinner table. My stepmother pushed my chair away. A military woman doesn't belong in this family. The room went silent. My stepbrother started recording his phone, raised like a weapon he'd been waiting years to use. My father stared at his plate. I stood there in my travel clothes, still smelling like airport coffee and 11 months of someone else's war. And I felt something inside me go very still, very cold, very calm. I stood up straight. I smiled. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. 3 days earlier, I'd been standing on a tarmac in Germany, watching a transport plane fold up the last 11 months of my life into a duffel bag. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and I had spent nearly a year running logistics for a battalion that never stopped moving, never stopped needing, never stopped testing what I was made of. I had learned to sleep in 4-hour intervals. I had learned to make decisions that mattered inside 60 seconds. What I had not learned, apparently, was how to walk into my father's dining room and be welcomed. My father called me the week before I came home. His voice had that particular warmth he saved for occasions, the same warmth he'd used at my college graduation and my commissioning ceremony. Moments where love was easy because it came with an audience. "We're doing a family dinner, Leah," he said. "Everyone wants to see you." I should have heard the word everyone for what it was, not just him, not just us. Everyone now included Linda, his wife of 6 years, and Brian, her son from a previous marriage, a 26-year-old who had never held a job longer than 8 months, and who called himself an entrepreneur, the way some men call themselves poets, as a way of avoiding the word unemployed. I bought gifts anyway, a leather wallet for my father, the kind he'd had in a catalog once years ago that I'd never forgotten. A bottle of bourbon for Brian because I still believed foolishly that decency could be modeled rather than demanded. And for Linda, a scarf, soft gray cashmere, chosen with more care than she probably imagined I was capable of. I have always believed that showing up with open hands says something a person can't argue with. I was wrong about that too, as it turned out. Some people don't want your open hands, they want your empty chair. The house looked the same as it always did, pale, yellow siding. The porch light my mother had picked out before she died. The maple tree I used to climb until my father told me, "Girls shouldn't be up in trees." My mother has been gone 11 years now, and the ache of that has softened into something more like weather than wound. A low-pressure system that moves through on certain days, and then moves on. I walked up that porch with a box of gifts, and a duffel bag still smelling of jet fuel. And I told myself this would be fine. Family is family, I told myself. That sentence has never once been simple, and it wasn't tonight, either. Linda opened the door with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Leah," she said like my name was something she'd had to practice. Brian was in the living room, feet on the coffee table, phone already in his hand, though nothing had happened yet, a detail I would only understand the weight of later. My father hugged me the way he always did, quick, a little stiff, a man who loved his daughter, and had never quite learned how to show it without an apology built into the gesture. "You look good," he said, tired but good. Dinner smelled like it always had in that house on special occasions. Roast chicken, rosemary, the yeasty warmth of Linda's dinner rolls, which I'll admit were genuinely good, a small, strange betrayal of my own resentment. The table was set with thee, my mother used to use only at Christmas. Nobody mentioned that. I noticed it the way I notice everything now, a habit the army gave me that civilian life has never managed to take back. Scan the room, catalog the details, know where the exits are. Linda talked through most of dinner prep about a reasonable, grounded life, about people who build things with their hands and their minds, rather than playing soldier for a paycheck and a pension. She said this while looking at a spot just past my shoulder, never quite at me, the coward's way of throwing a punch. My father said nothing. Brian smirked into his water glass. I told myself I would let it go. I had faced worse than a woman who resented a stepdaughter she never asked for. Then it was time to sit. I pulled out my chair. The one that had always been mine, the one on my mother's china side of the table. And Linda's hand shot out and pushed it 2 feet to the left hard enough that it scraped against the hardwood floor like a small scream. A military woman doesn't belong in this family, she said, loud enough for the whole table. Loud enough for God. Loud enough that there was no pretending afterward that it had been a joke or a slip. The room went dead silent. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. And Brian lifted his phone and started recording, grinning like a boy who had just been handed the best birthday present of his life. I looked at my father, he looked at his plate. I picked up my gifts, set them gently on the sideboard, so as not to give Brian the satisfaction of a dramatic exit, and I stood there for one long moment, feeling 11 months of discipline settle into my spine like armor. I smiled, not the tight, polite smile people expect from a woman who's just been humiliated, but something calmer, something that unsettled Linda far more than tears would have. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, I said, and I walked out into the cold October evening without raising my voice once. Behind me, I heard Brian laughing already, imagining how many views his video would get, already believing he'd just captured the moment his uptight, humorless sister finally got what was coming to her. He had no idea what he had actually just done. None of them did. The hotel room was quiet in a way my father's house never had been. And I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before I did anything at all. I didn't cry. I want to say that plainly, because I think people expect a woman who's just been humiliated at her own family's dinner table to fall apart, to call a friend and sob into the phone, to drink too much wine and stare at the ceiling. Norts, I didn't do any of that. I sat very still, the way I'd learned to sit still during long convoys and longer briefings, and I let the anger settle into something usable, instead of something that would burn me from the inside. What Linda didn't know, what almost none of them knew, was that I wasn't just a soldier who'd wandered off to play at a career my father's wife found embarrassing. My mother, before she died, had built something. She'd been sharp about money in a way people underestimated, because she wore cardigans and baked bread and never once raised her voice in an argument. She'd set aside investments over the years, quiet, patient, unglamorous. And when she passed, control of a good portion of that came to me, not in a lump sum I could spend on something foolish, but structured, protected, tied up in a trust with conditions she'd written herself. Conditions I hadn't thought much about in years, because I'd never had reason to. I never told my father the details, partly because grief made money feel obscene to talk about in the months after she died, and partly because I watched him remarry within 2 years, and understood in the private way children understand their parents, without being told that he needed a version of the story where he'd moved on cleanly, where nothing from his first marriage still had a hand on his life. I let him have that story. I stepped back. I visited on holidays, sent cards, kept my distance the way you keep distance from a stove you already know is hot, and I told myself that was maturity rather than avoidance. Around midnight, my phone started buzzing. A friend from high school, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, sent me a link with 3 exclamation points and no other words. Brian had posted the video. He'd captioned it something like, "When your sister thinks the army makes her better than everyone else." Misspelled, predictably, the word everyone rendered as everyone, which under different circumstances I might have found almost funny. The video had already picked up a few thousand views by the time I watched it. My own face calm and unreadable in the dim light of my father's dining room, Linda's voice sharp and satisfied beside me. The comments split the way comments always do. Some people defended me, called Linda cruel, called Brian pathetic for filming his own sister's humiliation instead of standing up. Others took Linda's side, said something about entitled veterans, said the military wasn't a personality, said a dozen small ugly things that would have stung more if I hadn't spent a career being underestimated by people who had never once had to make a decision that mattered. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't share it, didn't defend myself, didn't post some tearful video of my own explaining my side. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and let it happen without me. That restraint wasn't performance. It was strategy, though I didn't fully understand my own strategy yet. I only knew with the certainty of someone who has learned not to move until she understands the terrain that reacting now would cost me more than waiting would. The call from my lawyer came the next morning earlier than seeing his voice careful in the way lawyers get when they're about to hand you something heavier than small talk. His name was Walter Greaves, a quiet, precise man who had managed my mother's estate since before I'd finished my first deployment. And in 6 years he had never once called me without warning. "Lee," he said, "we need to talk about the house." I sat up straighter, coffee forgotten. He explained it slowly, the way you explain something to a person you suspect is about to be blindsided. The house my father lived in, the house I'd grown up in, the house with the maple tree and the porch light my mother chose, sat on land that had never actually belonged to my father outright. My mother had placed it along with several other assets into a trust years before she died. A trust designed to protect the property for the family long term, rather than leave it vulnerable to remarriage, debt, or bad decisions made in grief. My father had a life estate, the right to live there for as long as he wanted undisturbed, but he did not have the right to sell it. Any sale required the signature of the trust's co-trustee, me. I hadn't thought about that clause in years. I'd signed the original paperwork numbly, 24 years old and freshly grieving, barely reading the language my mother's lawyer had explained to me in careful, gentle sentences. I understood, sitting in that hotel room, with the morning light coming in flat and gray through the curtains, exactly why Linda had spent 6 years chipping away at my place in that family, why every holiday had felt like an audition I kept failing. Why she'd wanted me gone from that dinner table so badly she'd been willing to humiliate me in front of my own father to make it happen. It had never really been about the army at all. "Leah," Walter said, and I could hear him choosing his next words with unusual care, "someone has already filed paperwork to begin the sale." I met Walter in person, 2 days later in his office downtown. The kind of office that hadn't changed its furniture since my mother first sat across that same desk 20 years earlier. He had the file open before I even sat down, a manila folder thick with documents I hadn't looked at since I was a grieving 24-year-old signing whatever was placed in front of me. "I want to walk you through exactly what's happening," he said, "before you decide anything." I appreciated that about Walter. He had never once tried to tell me how to feel about my own family. He only ever told me the truth and let me arrive at my own conclusions. The picture he laid out was uglier than I expected, though. By then, I don't know why I expected anything else. Linda had been quietly pushing my father towards selling the house for the better part of a year, framing it always as practicality. The place was too big for 2 people, the taxes kept climbing. Wouldn't it be nice to downsize somewhere warmer, somewhere easier? What she never mentioned to him, what she'd apparently gone to some trouble to keep buried, was where the proceeds were actually meant to go. Brian had been developing what he called a business, some vague venture involving imported furniture, and an online store that, as far as Walter's preliminary digging could tell, existed mostly as a website and a dream. He needed capital. His mother intended to hand him a piece of my father's house to get it. The trust documents were specific in ways Linda clearly hadn't anticipated, or had hoped my father would never actually read closely. My mother, methodical even in her dying, had built-in language requiring co-trustee approval for any sale, transfer, or major encumbrance of the property with my signature, as the second trustee explicitly required. Somewhere along the way, Linda had either misunderstood this or, and this felt more likely given the pattern Walter was uncovering, chosen to believe she could get the paperwork through before anyone thought to check. She'd found a buyer fast, a young couple relocating for a new job, eager and a little naive. Exactly snorts, the kind of buyers who wouldn't ask too many questions about trustee structures if the price was right and the timeline was tight. Brian, for his part, seemed to have no idea any of this was remotely complicated. He posted about it the way he posted about everything, with more confidence than information. A photo of a gated community, 2 towns over captioned something about new beginnings and finally getting what we deserve. A story about test driving a car he clearly couldn't afford yet, tagged with a location at a dealership showroom. He believed, with the total certainty of a man who had never once had to earn anything, the slow way that he was about to be handed enough money to finally become the person he'd always told people he already was. I sat with all of this for a long moment, watching dust drift through the light from Walter's window, and I felt the old army instinct take over the part of me that had learned in convoys and command posts that the worst thing you can do with incomplete intelligence is act on it too early. The sale is void without my signature, I said. It wasn't a question. Walter nodded. Completely void. No court in the state would uphold a transfer that bypasses a named co-trustee, especially not one this clearly documented. Then I'm not going to stop it, I said. Walter looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look a careful man gives you when he suspects you're about to do something either very smart or very reckless, and hasn't yet decided which. You want to let it proceed? I want to let it get as far as the closing table, I said. I want them standing there, believing it's done before anyone tells them otherwise. I won't pretend that decision came from a place of pure discipline. Some part of it was anger, an old cold anger that had been sitting in me since a chair scraped against hardwood in front of my own father's silence. But most of it, if I'm honest, was something closer to justice than revenge. A need for the truth to arrive in a room where everyone could see it plainly, rather than in a private phone call. Linda could spin, minimize, or twist into another story about how unreasonable I was being. I had spent 6 years watching her control every narrative in that family, with quiet, patient persistence. I wasn't interested in fire and whispers. I wanted daylight. I didn't warn my father. That was the hardest part, harder than staying silent through dinner. Harder than watching Brian's video rack up comments I refused to read past the first few lines. My father was still in his heart a decent man who had simply never learned how to stand up to the people closest to him. Not to my mother when she was alive, and pushing him toward better choices, and not to Linda now. Warning him meant trusting. He could hold the secret, and some instinct, some old wound told me he couldn't. So I did the only thing that felt honest under the circumstances. I waited. 3 weeks passed in a strange, watchful quiet. I went back to work. Caught up on medical appointments the Army required, saw a few old friends who asked careful questions about the video, and accepted my vague answers without pushing. Meanwhile, Walter kept me updated in short, precise phone calls. The buyers had made an offer, the offer had been accepted, inspections were scheduled, then completed, and then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Walter called with the detail that told me the end was closer than I'd thought. They've got us a purchase agreement, he said. The just put down a deposit, $320,000 held in escrow. He paused. Closing is set for 2 weeks from Friday. The law office, where the closing was scheduled, sat on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. The kind of place with a view meant to make people feel like they were making an important decision. Which in this case, they very much were, whether they understood that yet or not. I arrived 20 minutes early, dressed not in uniform but in a simple charcoal suit, my hair pulled back the way I wore it for formal briefings. My expression I hoped unreadable. Walter met me in the hallway outside his face, composed, but his eyes carrying the particular energy of a man who has spent 3 weeks quietly building toward a moment he believes in. You don't have to do this the dramatic way, he said, not for the first time. I can simply block the filing before anyone gets in the room. I know, I said, but they need to see it happen, all of them. He didn't argue further. I think by then he understood something about me that even I hadn't fully articulated yet, that this was never only about stopping a fraudulent sale. It was about a family that had spent years underestimating me, dismissing 11 months of my life, spent commanding logistics for hundreds of soldiers as playing at a career, and I needed them to understand in a room with witnesses exactly how much they had misjudged. I waited in a small side office while the closing began, watching through a gap in the door. Linda arrived first, dressed the way she dressed for church or funerals. Something structured and expensive. Her chin lifted with the particular confidence of a woman who believes she has already won. Brian trailed behind, her phone raised, narrating for an audience that had grown considerably since his last video went semi-viral. "We're here," he said into the camera, grinning. "Closing on the house today, guys. Big day for the family." He had no idea how correct that sentence was about to become. My father arrived last, quieter than the other two, dressed in the same tan jacket he'd worn to my commissioning ceremony years earlier, a detail that struck me harder than I expected it to. He still believed, as far as I could tell, that this was simply a practical transition. An aging man downsizing with his wife's help. Nothing more sinister than that. He had no idea his late wife's trust was about to walk through that door in the form of his daughter. The buyers, a young couple named the Ortegas, sat across the table, looking cautiously hopeful, the way people look when they're about to make the biggest purchase of their lives, and are trying not to let their excitement show too plainly. The closing attorney, a calm older man named Mr. Pham, began working through the paperwork with practiced efficiency, sliding documents across the table for signatures, murmuring the small procedural phrases that fill these rooms: initial here, sign here, and here. Linda signed with a flourish. Brian kept filming, occasionally panning the camera toward his mother, with a proud, encouraging grin, as if she were closing a business deal on television. My father signed more slowly, the pen hovering a moment too long over the paper, the only visible sign that some part of him understood this moment carried more weight than he was letting himself feel. Then Mr. Pham paused, flipping back through the stack in front of him, his brow tightening slightly, in the particular way of a man who has just noticed something his checklist won't let him ignore. "We are missing one required trustee," he said, more to himself than to the room, scanning the trust documentation a second time. "The property is held under a trust with co-trustee signature requirements. I only have Mr. Thompson's signature here." Linda's smile flickered just barely. "That shouldn't be necessary," she said quickly. "My husband owns the property outright. According to this document," Mr. Pham said, tapping the page, "he holds a life estate. The trust itself requires the signature of a second trustee for any transfer or sale." He looked up. "Is there someone else who needs to be present?" That was my moment, and I took it without hurrying, walking through the door the way I'd walked into command briefings 100 times before, calm, deliberate, but betraying nothing. "That would be me," I said. The room went silent in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. Brian's phone lowered, and the live stream still running, still capturing every second of what was about to unfold, a fact he would come to regret bitterly in the weeks ahead. Linda's face drained of color so fast it was almost clinical, her mouth opening slightly before closing again with nothing to say. My father turned toward me, with an expression I couldn't fully read, shock certainly, but underneath it, something that looked almost like relief, as if some part of him had been waiting for someone to finally stop this train before it reached the end of the tracks. I set a folder on the table. The documents Walter had prepared weeks earlier, the original trust, my mother's signature at the bottom, in the careful looping handwriting I would recognize anywhere. The clause naming me co-trustee with equal authority over any transfer of the property. Mr. Pham reviewed it methodically, and within minutes confirmed what I already knew. The sale as structured could not proceed. Not that day, not without my consent, which I made clear calmly, and without raising my voice. I had no intention of giving. The Ortegas, to their credit, handled the news with more grace than anyone else in the room. But their agent, watching a $300, thousand deposit suddenly hang in legal limbo was considerably less gracious, and by the time everyone filed out of that office, I heard him on the phone in the hallway, voice tight with fury, already using words like misrepresentation and legal action in the same sentence as Linda's name. My father didn't speak on the drive back to the house. I rode with him, Linda and Brian having left separately, in a silence so heavy even Brian had stopped filming, some instinct finally catching up to him, that this was no longer content, that this was his family actually falling apart in real time. My father gripped the steering wheel with both hands, knuckles pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead in the particular way of a man, trying very hard not to let his face show what he was feeling. When we finally pulled into the driveway, he sat there a long moment before turning off the engine. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about the trust, about any of it." "I know," I said. "Your mother never told me." "She told me the week before she died," I said. "I think she knew even then that things might change after she was gone, that people might not stay who they seemed to be." I hadn't meant it as an accusation, but I watched it land on him like one anyway, and I let the silence sit, rather than soften it. Some truths don't need softening. They need room to be understood. Walter arrived an hour later with the full file, the same one he'd shown me weeks before. Except now he laid it out across my father's kitchen table, piece by piece, patiently, the way you'd walk someone through a diagnosis they weren't prepared for. My father read through it in near silence, occasionally removing his glasses to press his fingers against his eyes, and I watched 11 years of a marriage he'd trusted completely reveal itself as something considerably more complicated than he'd allowed himself to see. There were emails Linda had exchanged with a real estate agent nearly a year earlier, long before she'd ever mentioned downsizing to my father, discussing the property's value and potential buyers, with a specificity that made clear this had never been a spontaneous idea born of practical concerns. There were text messages between Linda and Brian, screenshots the young couple's own agent had actually forwarded to Walter once the deal collapsed and questions started flying about. Who had known what messages in which Linda assured her son the sale was basically done and told him not to worry about the details, that she'd handle Leah's part when the time came. Whatever handling me had meant, it apparently hadn't included telling me anything at all. Worse, buried near the bottom of the file, was something Walter had only uncovered in the final days, before closing a document, purporting to be an old amendment to the trust, supposedly signed by my mother years before her death, granting my father expanded authority to sell the property without co-trustee approval under certain conditions. The signature on it was close enough that a distracted eye might not question it, but Walter, who had spent decades staring at my mother's actual signature on dozens of documents, had flagged it immediately as inconsistent. The pressure wrong, the loop of the L, slightly too controlled, too deliberate, the kind of forgery that comes from someone practicing in private, rather than signing in the natural rush of a real life. He'd sent it quietly to a document examiner, the week before, closing less as an accusation and more as due diligence, and the results had come back only that morning before we'd even walked into the closing room. Forged. Not with total certainty in every technical sense, the examiner had noted, but with enough confidence that no attorney or court would treat it as authentic. My father set the papers down and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me. "Did you know about this one before today?" "Walter told me an hour before we walked in," I said. I didn't want to believe it either. Brian showed up at the house that evening uninvited, his face carrying an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the smug confidence of the dinner table video, not the eager grin of his live streams, but something closer to fear. He'd apparently spent the afternoon on the phone with his mother, and whatever she'd told him hadn't matched what he was now hearing from my father in the kitchen. Mom said the trust thing was a formality. He said to no one in particular. She said it was basically already handled. It wasn't a formality, my father said, and his voice had a firmness in it I hadn't heard directed at Linda or Brian in years. "It was fraud, Brian. Someone forged your grandmother's signature." I watched something shift in Brian's face. then watched 26 years of unquestioning loyalty to his mother crack under the specific, undeniable weight of a forged document sitting on a kitchen table. He didn't defend her. He didn't say another word, actually. Just sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and stared at his hands, and for the first time since I'd known him, I felt something closer to pity than contempt. Linda arrived 20 minutes later, still in her closing day clothes, her composure noticeably thinner than it had been that morning. My father met her at the door before she could even step inside, and I heard his voice through the screen low and controlled in a way that told me exactly how much restraint it was costing him. "Pack a bag tonight," he said. "I want you out by morning. The internet has a long memory when it wants one." And within days of the closing collapsing, someone connected the dots between Brian's original dinner table video and the growing rumors about a forged trust document circulating in local real estate circles. Someone had recognized my father's street in the background of one of Brian's live streams. Someone else had put together a timeline. And before long, the old clip, the one where Linda shoved my chair aside and told me a military woman didn't belong in this family, was resurfacing with a very different caption attached to it. This time, people weren't just commenting on a stepmother's cruelty. They were connecting it to a woman who had apparently tried to defraud her own husband and stepdaughter out of a house that had never fully belonged to her. Brian bore the brunt of it first, and in some ways, I think that was fair, though I never took pleasure in watching it happen. The comments on his original video, the ones that had once been split fairly evenly between people defending him and people criticizing him, tilted hard and fast in one direction once the fuller story emerged. People pointed out correctly that he'd filmed his own sister's humiliation, not because he cared about justice or family loyalty, but because he'd believed it would make good content, would rack up views, would paint him as the clever son in on a joke at my expense. Now that same video was being used as evidence of exactly the kind of person he was, someone who filmed cruelty instead of stopping it. The financial fallout hit him even harder than the public embarrassment. The Ortega's agent, furious at watching a $300,000 deposit tied up in legal limbo because of what he was now calling accurately a fraudulent transaction, filed a formal complaint against Linda with the State Real Estate Commission, and separately pursued a civil claim to recover damages and legal costs. Brian's furniture business, the one he'd been counting on funding through his mother's scheme, evaporated before it ever truly existed. No house sale meant no capital. No capital meant no inventory. No inventory meant the whole venture folded quietly, the website taken down within a week. The dream of a gated community 2 towns over reduced to a handful of screenshots. People online delighted in reposting with cruel new captions of their own. Linda hired a lawyer almost immediately, a sharp, expensive one from a firm 2 counties over, and I heard through Walter that her defense strategy leaned heavily on distancing herself from the forged document, insisting she'd had no direct knowledge it wasn't authentic, that she'd simply trusted an old family friend who'd helped locate the paperwork. Whether that was true or not, I honestly couldn't say with certainty, and some part of me suspected I never fully would. What I did know, from the document examiner's findings and the pattern of emails Walter had compiled, was that someone had gone to considerable trouble to make that signature convincing, and Linda had been the only person with a clear motive to want it to exist. My father called me 2 weeks after everything fell apart, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years, and asked if I would come by the house. I drove over expecting another conversation about paperwork, about lawyers, about the mechanical business of untangling a marriage from a fraud investigation. Instead, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd once eaten Sunday dinners as a family of 3 before Linda, before Brian, before any of it. He'd made coffee. He didn't drink his. "I keep thinking about that night," he said, not looking up. "The dinner." I didn't say anything. I'd learned over the years that silence was often the more honest response when someone was working their way towards something difficult. "I sat there," he said, "and I watched her push your chair, and I watched Brian film it, and I didn't say a single word." He finally looked up at me and his eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since my funeral. I told myself I was keeping the peace. That's what I told myself, that I was just trying to keep things calm. But I wasn't keeping the peace, Leah. I was choosing her comfort over your dignity. And I've had 11 months to figure out how to say that to you. And I still don't know how. I sat down across from him, the coffee between us going cold, and I thought about 11 months in Germany, about all the versions of strength the army had taught me: how to hold a room, how to make a hard call, how to stand perfectly still while someone underestimated me, and let that underestimate become their mistake instead of mine. None of that training had prepared me for this particular moment. My father's voice cracking over a cold cup of coffee, finally saying the thing I'd needed to hear for 6 years. The thing that hurt the most wasn't what she said. I told him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. It was your silence. I could have handled her. I've handled worse than Linda Thompson. What I couldn't handle was watching my own father look at his plate instead of looking at me. He didn't try to defend himself after that. He just put his face in his hands, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I watched my father cry. Not the careful, controlled tears of a funeral, but something raw, something that had clearly been sitting in him for a long time, waiting for someone to finally give him permission to let it out. I had every legal right to remove my father from that house. As co-trustee, once the fraud was fully documented, and Linda's claim to any interest in the property was dissolved, Walter told me plainly that I could restructure the trust however I saw fit, could sell the property immediately if I wanted, could even ask my father to find somewhere else to live. If some part of me had wanted to punish him further, for 11 months of silence, I'd carried like a stone in my chest. I sat with that option for exactly one evening alone in my apartment near base, staring at the ceiling the way I had the night of the dinner. And I understood by morning that I had no interest in becoming the kind of person who used power the way it had just been used against me. I called Walter the next day and asked him to draft an amendment instead. My father would retain his life estate undisturbed for as long as he wanted to live in that house. The porch light my mother had chosen still burning every evening, the maple tree still standing in the side yard, whatever piece remained for him still intact. But I added something new, something my mother, I think, would have approved of even more than the original trust. Upon my father's passing, the house would be sold, and the full proceeds would fund a scholarship for the children of service members killed in the line of duty. A small, permanent thing built out of a story that could have ended in nothing but bitterness. My father cried again when I told him, though more quietly this time, more like relief than grief. You didn't have to do that, he said, after everything. I know, I said. That's why I did it. Brian came to see me about a month later, driving out to the small town near my base in a car considerably less impressive than the one he'd been test driving in his old posts. He looked different, thinner, somehow quieter. A young man who had spent several weeks watching his mother's life come apart on a public stage he himself had helped build. He apologized, and I believed him mostly because the apology came without any request attached to it. No ask for money. No ask for a second chance at the business. Just a plain halting admission that he'd been cruel and careless, and that he understood now exactly what he'd cost people, including himself. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it. But I also told him gently that forgiveness and closeness were two different things, and that I didn't know if I'd ever fully trust him the way family is supposed to trust each other. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, like some part of him already knew he hadn't yet earned anything more. Linda's case moved through the system slower than any of us expected, the way these things often do. The real estate commission suspended proceedings pending the outcome of the forgery investigation, and the Ortega's civil suit against her dragged into the following spring, ending, eventually in a settlement that cost her far more than the profit she'd been chasing. I heard secondhand that she'd moved to a small apartment 2 towns over, that she and my father finalized their divorce quietly without the dramatics that had defined so much of their marriage's final year. I never spoke to her again after that night at the closing table, and I've made peace with the fact that I probably never will. I went back to my unit that spring, back to the particular rhythm of a life spent in service to something larger than my own family drama. And I found myself thinking more than once about the strange shape justice had taken in this story. I hadn't sued anyone out of spite. I hadn't posted my own video, hadn't fought Linda's cruelty with cruelty of my own, hadn't given Brian the satisfaction of watching me lash out the way his video had clearly hoped I would. I had simply waited quietly for the truth to walk into a room on its own and let it stand there in front of everyone until there was nothing left to argue about. The morning I drove back to base, my father walked me out to my car, the way he used to. When I first left for basic training all those years ago, standing in the driveway, with his hands in his pockets, watching me load the last of my things into the trunk. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said, and his voice didn't crack this time, steady in a way it hadn't been in months. I looked back at the house one last time. The yellow siding, the porch light, the maple tree with its branches bare and waiting for spring. And I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. Something that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite triumph, but sat somewhere honest between the two. I had lost a stepmother I never wanted, and a stepbrother I might never fully trust again. But I had gotten something back that mattered more. A father who finally understood what his silence had cost, and the quiet certainty that some inheritances aren't about money or houses at all. They're about who chooses in the end to stand up for you when it matters, and who simply looks down at their plate. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where it landed with you. Have you ever had to wait quietly for the truth to speak for itself? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I'm always amazed by how many of you carry stories just like this one. We share stories like Leah's every single day here, real, raw, and full of the kind of justice that doesn't always come fast, but always comes fair. If you want to keep walking these journeys with me, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story.